This is the arc in which Asuna's reputation suffers the most. I think that a lot of the narratives that stem from it, such as her being weak or being reduced to a damsel in distress and other shitty Twitter takes of this nature, not only grossly misrepresent the truth, but are also really unfair and disingenuous towards her efforts in what was an impossible situation. So I think the first thing I should do is address just why she was in this situation in the first place. To answer this, I'm going to share some insight that Reki, the author of the series, gave us when commenting on his thought process during the making of Fairy Dance. The gist of the part I'm going to share is that firstly, after all they had gone through in Aincrad, Reki felt that together there was almost no problem that Asuna and Kirito couldn't overcome. Thus, he chose to split them up. Secondly, in ALO, you do not die in real life after dying in the game. It's not very exciting if there aren't any stakes in a battle due to the combatants being able to simply respawn and try again after all. So rather than using death as a penalty for failure and the main motivation for the characters to not dilly-dally around, instead he used time. From Kirito's side, if Asuna does not awaken soon, then her father is going to pair her up in an arranged marriage with the despicable man that is Sugu. Since she is unconscious and trapped within the world of ALO, she cannot object, even though Kirito knows she almost certainly would. Thus, he is motivated to move and try to find her within the shortest amount of time possible. From Asuna's side, Sugu, in his arrogance, tells her of his plot to use the trapped SAO players in his possession as free human test subjects, allowing him to move swiftly towards completing his research of the manipulation of the brain, ultimately with the goal of altering memories and emotions. He would then sell that completed research to a foreign government for assumed military purposes. This was illegal and a gross violation of human rights. But nonetheless, he was scarily close to completing this goal, with it only coming closer and closer to materializing with each passing day. If Asuna did not find a way to escape and inform the law enforcement, then not only would this malicious plan come to fruition, but there was also a threat of him using the results of the research on her. This creates tension and a sense of urgency for Asuna to escape her entrapment as soon as possible. So to that end, escaping her entrapment is what she did everything in her power to do. Asuna did not take being entrapped lying down, despite what people would have you believe. It's an impossible task in which she used every little thing in her disposal to overcome. The first step was to obtain a keycode for the lock upon her cage. The problem was, when Sugu typed the keycode to leave the cage, the distance effect would obstruct Asuna's view of it. However, she came up with the idea to use the mirror in the cage in order to see Sugu's inputs clearly. So now she had to wait for an opportunity to look at the mirror naturally while he was leaving the cage, as if she were to just do it suddenly, apropos of nothing, it would arouse suspicion. And so, she patiently waited for her chance to finally come. When Sugu was taunting her about Kirito and her hopeless situation, she used this moment to feign letting his words get to her by turning away from him and pretending to cry, when in actuality, she was now facing the mirror, allowing her patience to be rewarded by finally scoring the keycard when he left the cage. While this was a huge victory for her, she could not be reckless. The second thing she had to do was get some sort of loose idea of the time. If she had a chance to escape, it would only come once. There was zero room for failure. Thus, she had to do everything she could in order to make sure that her first chance at escape was a successful one. To that end, even if she were to be able to break out of the cage, she could not just recklessly do it straight away. If she were to do that, it was highly likely that she would run into the staff that were conducting the illegal research, or even worse, Sugu himself, at which point she would be immediately recaptured with more than likely even tighter security, making escape even more impossible than it currently was. So in order to minimize the chance of running into staff and being discovered, she would aim to escape late at nighttime in the real world. The only problem was that she was given no means to know the time in the real world. It's not like she could just use the sun in ALO to tell either, as Sugu had informed her that the day-night cycle in ALO was different to that of the real world. All she knew was that her internal clock was strong due to waking up relatively early in the morning pretty much every day for most of her life. So even in ALO, she would wake up at what she assumed was this time, regardless of whether it was night or day inside of ALO. Her next clue was given to her by Sugu's actions. He would visit her every other day when his business was completed. He would use the terminal system from within the company to full dive into ALO. From being a longtime friend of the Yuki family, Asuna was aware that Sugu was the type of person to establish a comfortable routine and stick to it. So she was confident in assuming his schedule would not change very often, if at all. Since he would visit her at the end of the working day, from there, by adding on roughly how much time she thought had passed in his visit to her, she had a much better estimate of just how long it would be until late at night in the real world. And so, as soon as he left, she would try her best to accurately keep track of the time in her mind to the best of her ability. Around 5-ish hours had passed, and then she made her move. Since now it would already be past midnight already in the real world, there should be significantly less staff in the area. In the first place, since it was a secret illegal operation that Sugu was conducting under her father's nose, Asuna summarized that there shouldn't be that much staff anyway, just a small group that Sugu trusted. So while Asuna made her way through the lab, her careful planning bore fruit, as she did not run into any staff. She would eventually make her way to an elevator that she found from the mats she encountered along the way, opting to take the elevator to the bottommost floor of the lab. Upon arrival, Asuna would come across the trapped SEO players that were being used as human test subjects. Asuna is an incredibly empathetic person. While this is a good quality to have, in this instance it would somewhat work against her, as she wastes precious time being distracted by the tragic situation that the trapped SEO players found themselves in. It's not the first time that this trait of hers has been shown to us, the audience, either, as Aincrad actually would have gotten her killed against Gleameyes, which is the 74th floor boss if you don't remember. Remember, that fight started because the army had foolishly and recklessly tried to fight the boss by themselves. Not only did they have no information on the boss's attacks, but they were also completely exhausted and numbered relatively few, resulting in not really a boss fight, but instead a one-sided slaughter in which the army would all perish. Kirito was hesitant over what to do, as it was very unlikely that they would be able to help. In the end, he probably would have let them all die, but Asuna could not bear to watch this happen, and so even though going in there would pretty much mean her death, she would charge in anyway. Now, lucky for her, Kirito did have the dual wielding skill, allowing him to just barely DPS down the boss before it wiped them. But going back to her in the lab, this blunder of wasting time is what most likely cost her escape, as unfortunately for Asuna, there were staff doing a night shift in the area. Due to that, she was just barely unable to navigate to the log out function of the terminal, as the staff caught her. But despite her chance of escape slipping through her fingers and her plan falling to ruin, she did not give up. She struggled until the very end and stole the keycard that was in the terminal from under the staff's noses. This keycard would ultimately be pivotal to finally freeing her, as even though Kirito and co managed to break through the sentinels guarding the world tree, he and Yui would have been rendered powerless to get through the locked door had it not been for the keycard that Asuna stole. So had she just simply given in to her fate and awaited to be rescued like most people would have you believe, Kirito and Yui would not have been able to cross that door, resulting in them being slaughtered from behind by the mass of sentinels coming for them, having to ultimately accept that the grand quest was a lie and the world tree was unassailable. Which would mean that Sugu would have successfully completed his inhumane research and the world would have probably been a much darker place. But it was because Asuna never gave up, did not give in to Sugu's constant taunts or her hopeless situation and defied her fate, struggling with everything she had until the very end, that keycard was able to end up in Kirito's hands. And because of that, she was ultimately freed and Sugu's illegal doings were foiled.